Hey guys, new video series today. We're doing a video series on building an AR-15. And what this is not a video series on how to actually put one together. This series is going to be about the individual components, how to pick them out, and how to get the right stuff so that your build is successful and you don't have problems. Oftentimes I look around and I see there's a lot of resources for actually putting an AR-15 together, but there's very few that explain the individual parts, what's needed, and how they work and what they do so that you understand the rifle and you can build it successfully without wasting your time and money returning a bunch of parts. Today's video is the buttstock. We're not going to do, I was originally going to do the lower as a whole video, but there's just too much to go over. So we're going to focus primarily on the buttstock. What you see here is 3 fixed buttstocks. Now here in New York we can't have the collapsible. We are going to discuss them at length. So I'll explain real quick what we have here is we have an A2 buttstock, a Magpul MOE rifle stock, and this is just a cheap budget Chinese made skeleton stock. The reason why I have it is because this one actually has an interesting configuration in that it uses a carbine tube on a fixed stock, which is kind of a rarity, but we'll get more into that. So buttstocks, anywhere from $20 up to like $200-300. You have your primary choice is between fixed and collapsible. Pretty much collapsible is the most common and most popular nowadays. The fixed stocks, people tend to use them for specific rifles, as well as states like New York here that have weird, crazy laws about it. And I know people are going to ask, so we'll cover it real quick. This is the AR-15 spur. This is a compliance part. This one here has a mag lock, so you can't get the magazine out no matter how hard you push. And this one here has kind of a homemade mag lock, which uses a little clever welding and epoxy that also locks the magazine in place. So these are all New York legal. So with that said, let's get moving here. And by the way, there's reviews, a lot of this stuff on the channel if you want to see. So your buttstock, we're going to start with fixed, go into collapsible. Your fixed buttstock is pretty much going to be made of a couple things. One is the actual buttstock itself. Traditionally they're held in with a screw that goes into the tube in the back. Your receiver extension, which is what's under this piece of foam here, it's an aluminum tube that's threaded, that threads into your lower receiver. And you're also going to need a buffer and spring. And that's pretty much it for that system. Now, of course, there's lots of add-ons like sling mounts and different things like that, and end plates and all that fun jazz. But let's talk about the buttstock, because too many videos just talk about accessories. Your buttstock, not only is it something that you use for your rifle to hold it properly, but it also has a functional purpose in the AR-15. There is a receiver tube under each and every one of these buttstocks, whether it's collapsible or not, and that receiver holds, as I mentioned, your buffer and buffer spring. Now, how this works is you have to imagine that your gun has gone off. The bolt, under the power of gas, is going to be forced backwards. It's going to compress this spring in the tube. It's going to be in this tube. It's going to compress it and shoot back forward and use that spring power to cycle the weapon. Now, it's a very simple system, but I do see some confusion sometimes where people mess this up. And primarily because they try and build piece by piece and they don't understand fully what they need. So, let's take a look at the A2 rifle stock. What am I going to need for an A2? Very simple. Like I mentioned, you're going to need a full-length receiver extension. There's also a small aluminum spacer that goes in the back. It's like a $2 part and usually comes with most receiver extensions. At least the full-length ones, because obviously most of them need them. This Magpul doesn't need that spacer, so you can just chuck it away, throw it in your parts bin. So you're going to have a tube, you're going to have your buttstock, and that buttstock is going to attach to the tube via a small screw in the back. Tube screws in, like I mentioned before, it's threaded. And then from there is where it gets confusing. It shouldn't be, but like I said, we have this little hybrid one here that's kind of goofy. Typically, you're going to need, for a fixed stock, you're going to need a rifle buffer, which is a longer buffer than this carbine buffer, which you see on the left here. The rifle buffer is longer because you have more room for it to cycle back. So now on the other hand, with these carbine buffers, they need to be shorter and heavier because they have less room to move under the compression of the spring. So typically, whenever you have a fixed stock, ignore this oddball here, you're always going to need a rifle length buffer, which is a longer buffer. They come, you know, there's all this, these things come in, you know, cheap $10 all the way up to, you can get, you know, nice specialty ones that are like filled with tungsten for like 150 bucks. All depends on what you want to spend and what you want. As you can hear, there's some weights inside. All this thing's purpose is to basically slow down the weapon and to control the cycling rate. So if you have a fixed stock, you need a rifle length buffer. Unless you have an oddball, but you'll know if you have an oddball. Like I said, if your tube is a shorter carbine length tube, you're going to need the carbine buffer. Now the springs are different also, and this is where I see people make mistakes as well. The rifle length spring is a lot longer and the carbine length shorter. So make sure when you're buying these that you understand that there are two different lengths, and you do need to make sure you get the right length for your stock. So rifle length longer, carbine length shorter. Now, however, guys, I got to explain, there is no performance difference between carbine length and rifle. Those are merely, what you have is a shorter, heavier weight that helps the weapon cycle in a smaller area of space. It does not matter anything about your upper whatsoever as to which one you have. So it's basically determined on whether you have that full length receiver extension or the carbine length. And it does not matter if your rifle is 16 inches or 24 inches. You can use either system with pretty much any upper. These are completely independent of the upper, which I know confuses a lot of people because they can. Some people I often hear assume that you need these little carbine buffers if you have the 16-inch M4 style. That's not the case. You can have that and put that on either system. Okay, that's as simple as it gets, guys. Buttstock, receiver extension, spring, buffer, screw for the back, goes together in 2 minutes. Really not a lot you can mess up on the fixed length. Now let's move into adjustable. I really got to get an adjustable, guys, just so I can do more with these videos when I'm doing this stuff. But adjustables typically are going to be adjustable for length. A lot of them have 6 positions along, and what they are is a extension tube, which is typically carbine length. I don't see many rifle length adjustables. In fact, I don't even think they make them. So it's typically going to be carbine length, so you're going to have the shorter tube, and it's going to have an attachment on the bottom that lets your stock slide up and down the stock. Now, here's where things get confusing, and I see a lot of mistakes, because the carbine length tube comes in 2 different sizes, mil-spec and commercial. And yes, they do make a difference. You can't interchange the parts between them. If you have a mil-spec tube, you have to have a stock for mil-spec. So that's where the problem tends to arise, and the confusion is that difference in basically the diameter of that tube. Now, it's a very small difference, and it's pretty much negligible. I hear a lot of people say, always get mil-spec, always get mil-spec. Guys, in this case, the mil-spec is only referring to the diameter. It's not referring to the quality. It's not referring to any of that. You can get a commercial tube that is mil-spec, but what they're referring to is the diameter, not the quality. So let's make sure that's 100% clear. So when you're getting your carbine adjustable tube, you have to decide whether you're going to go with mil-spec or commercial. Nowadays, pretty much buttstocks are available in both. Magpul, who's one of the biggest makers of buttstocks around, makes theirs equally in both. They're pretty easy to get. So it's really not something you should agonize over. And from what I've seen, there's really no performance difference. I've never heard of anyone destroying a commercial length or, ruining your tube is one of the hardest things to do on a rifle. So at least I've never heard of it happening. So choose mil-spec or commercial. Sometimes it's easier just to pick mil-spec because then you always remember, you know, it's mil-spec. Sometimes for me, when you have that choice, just buy mil-spec, it's easier to remember, and then you won't be doubting whether or not. If you always stick with mil-spec, you'll know everything's mil-spec. But it is just diameter, nothing to do with performance or anything like that. Now, of course, your adjustable stocks are always going to use the carbine length system. So they're always going to have the carbine buffer, and they're always going to have the carbine length spring. If you put a rifle length buffer into a carbine tube, it's going to short circuit. Whoops. There's not enough room. It's going to come back. It will not fully cycle the weapon. It will not allow the bolt to come back far enough to cycle. So you will have problems if you do that. So you'll know right away that the rifle just will not cycle. You will not be able to load a new round into the chamber, no matter how hard you try. Now the adjustables, we've gone over the tube difference. There is no difference in your buffers as far as commercial or mil-spec. You just buy a carbine buffer, carbine spring, no difference whatsoever. That diameter is the outer diameter, not the inner, so it doesn't affect the internal components. So, in review, we've covered everything here. Fixed length stock always goes with a full length receiver extension tube, full length buffer, full length spring. Weird, freaky, rare combos like this, using a carbine length tube, we'll use a carbine buffer, carbine spring. Now, adjustable, we'll typically only use carbine length, and you have to pick between mil-spec or commercial tube diameter, and then from there you're always going to use the carbine buffer, carbine spring. So with that said, that's what you need to know in order to build your AR-15, at least for the buttstock. We're going to move on probably to the lower receiver in the next portion, but that's it, that's simple. Of course, the biggest areas of confusion are the buffers. Which buffer do I need, which spring do I need, and which size tube if you are doing the adjustable. And one thing to mention, guys, if I didn't mention it, when you are doing an adjustable stock, you have to make sure the stock is matched up with your tube. So if you have a commercial tube, you need a commercial stock. If you have a mil-spec tube, you need a mil-spec stock. And once again, mil-spec does not mean quality. It is the outer diameter of the tube. So very important. And there you go, guys. Part 1 complete, the buttstock.